This lake belongs to the HOA. You don't have any right to be here. I was still carrying boxes out of the moving truck. I'm just unloading, ma'am. She folded her arms. I don't care. This lake, these docks, this entire shoreline, they're ours. Your name isn't on any of it. I gave a small nod. Understood. She pointed toward the water. Stay away from the lake. Don't step onto a single dock and haul away that excuse for a boat, or the sheriff will do it for you. Yes, ma'am. My son's bed frame was still balanced in my hands when she drove up and started listing everything she claimed I wasn't allowed to use. Moving boxes were scattered across the lawn. Before I had even unlocked the front door, she was demanding ownership of my lake. What she had no idea about was that my grandfather had built every dock those 42 families had been using for the last 9 years. The deed proving it was sitting inside my truck less than 10 feet behind her. I stayed silent. For the moment, my grandfather, Walter Garrison, created Garrison Lake with his own hands, and that wasn't an exaggeration. Back in 1968, he dammed a creek on his 200-acre property in Transylvania County, North Carolina, then spent the next 3 years watching the valley slowly become a lake. By 1971, there was a 40-acre lake, a sturdy stone home on the north shore, and 14 docks he built himself using pressure-treated lumber and galvanized hardware. He drove every piling into the ground, set every anchor, and tied every cleat with his own hands. That lake was the greatest achievement of his life. Then, in 1983, a developer offered to buy the surrounding land for an upscale neighborhood. Grandpa sold the surrounding parcels but never gave up the water. The paperwork couldn't have been clearer. Walter Garrison kept ownership of the lakebed, every riparian and littoral right, the shoreline extending 50 feet above the normal waterline, and every dock he had already built or would ever build. The developer named the neighborhood Garrison Lake Estates, carved the name into a massive stone entrance sign, and conveniently failed to tell a single homeowner who the real Garrison family actually was. I didn't spend my childhood at the lake. My father moved us to Norfolk before I enlisted in the Navy, and I served 18 years with the Seabees, constructing ports, piers, and military bases in places most people couldn't even locate on a map. When I returned from my final deployment, my wife was already battling a serious illness. Jenny fought with everything she had for 2 long years, but in the end, she lost. Our son, Owen, was only 7 years old. After her funeral, I buried myself in work because standing still hurt more than staying busy. Then, 4 months ago, my grandfather passed away and left me the lake house. Something inside me changed. Owen deserved a home that wasn't surrounded by memories of hospitals. I needed somewhere that still carried the feeling of family. We drove up the gravel driveway on a cool Saturday morning in late September. The air carried the scent of damp pine trees and fresh red clay. Owen climbed out before I even turned off the engine and sprinted straight toward the nearest dock. He stopped at the edge, stared across the calm water, and quietly asked, "Dad, is this where Grandpa Walt lived?" I nodded. The smile that spread across his face was one I hadn't seen since before Jenny became sick. Half the moving truck still needed unloading when a white Cadillac Escalade eased into the driveway. It glided to a stop like a luxury yacht pulling into a private marina. The driver's door swung open, and a woman stepped out looking as though she belonged at an exclusive country club fundraiser instead of standing on a dirt road deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Her platinum blonde hair fell in soft waves, and she wore a crisp white linen dress that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. Bright red heels pressed into the gravel like narrow stilts. Oversized Chanel sunglasses rested on top of her head. A caramel Hermes Birkin bag hung casually from her forearm like it belonged in a magazine shoot. The scent of Chanel No. 5 reached me before she did, floating across the yard like it had been sent ahead to announce her arrival. "Welcome to Garrison Lake Estates." She offered her hand. Her fingernails were painted glossy red and shaped into perfect almonds. "I'm Brenda Ashworth, president of the Homeowners Association." I shook her hand. It was cool, soft, almost like shaking hands with a department store mannequin that somehow learned to speak. "Just a couple of formalities, sweetheart." She handed me a white envelope. Inside was an official HOA letter ordering me to remove my boat from the community lake within 48 hours or face fines of $500 a day. It also demanded I remove my unauthorized dock and immediately stop using the lake without HOA approval. I read the notice twice before looking back toward the water. 14 docks lined the shoreline. Pontoon boats, kayaks, and jet skis belonged to the neighbors, all resting on docks my grandfather had built with his own hands on property he had never sold. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my back pocket. Thanks for the warm welcome. Brenda tipped her head slightly and smiled even wider. The people who lived here before you understood how this community works. I'm sure you'll learn quickly. She turned, walked back toward the Escalade, and her heels left tiny holes in the soft gravel, each one feeling like the final period at the end of a threat. The door shut, the engine hummed quietly, and the white SUV rolled away while the smell of Chanel No. 5 stayed behind like a warning nobody else seemed to notice. Owen walked back from the dock. Dad? Are we in trouble? I looked at my son, then at the lake, then at the 14 docks stretching across the shoreline like the ribs of something that had suddenly become my responsibility. No, buddy. We're home. The first week passed peacefully. I unpacked the remaining boxes, repaired a dripping kitchen faucet, and began inspecting every dock. 18 years with the Seabees had taught me to examine structures the same way a doctor studies a patient. Every split board, every sagging beam, every rusted bolt told part of the story. Dock number 1, the closest to the house, was still holding together well. Grandpa Walt had built it using cedar pilings. Favorite place. He would sit with his legs hanging over the edge, quietly watching the herons drift across the lake. For the first time in 3 years, he looked like a little boy instead of someone carrying more sadness than a child ever should. On Thursday, while I was replacing warped decking on dock number 1, a silver Honda pulled into the driveway. A man wearing a polo shirt and khaki pants stepped out holding a clipboard and a tape measure. Without saying a word, he walked right past me, stepped onto the dock, and immediately began taking measurements. Can I help you? I asked. HOA compliance inspection. He replied without even bothering to look up. Tom Briggs, HOA board member. I watched him measure the dock from end to end, check the railing height, and record the spacing between every support post. He scribbled figures onto his clipboard with the concentration of someone trying to defuse an explosive. You got a license to inspect property, Tom? He paused, looked at me, glanced at the clipboard, then stared at the dock as if it might answer for him. I'm authorized by the HOA board. That's not what I asked. Tom slipped the clipboard beneath his arm, mumbled something about filing a report, then headed back to his silver Honda. The engine didn't start until the third attempt. The following morning, I found a wicker basket sitting on my front porch. Lavender sprigs were tied together with a silk ribbon. A handwritten note on thick cream-colored cardstock, written in flawless cursive, read, "Just a friendly reminder, neighbor." Beneath the lavender was another letter from the HOA. This one accused me of making unauthorized alterations to dock number 1, the same replacement planks I had installed, and assessed a fine of $3,000. $3,000 for repairing rotten boards on a dock my grandfather had built on property my family had owned for more than 50 years. The notice ended with a cheerful little heart. By then, I was beginning to understand exactly how Brenda Ashworth operated. The sweetness wasn't genuine. It was camouflage. She wrapped every threat in flowers, perfume, and polished manners, the same way someone might hide a razor blade inside velvet. You didn't realize you'd been cut until the blood was already running. Later that afternoon, I walked down to dock number 7. An older man sat in a faded canvas chair with a fishing rod resting against the railing. His hair was white, his face weathered by years in the sun, and his hands looked like they had spent a lifetime building and fixing things. He looked up, gave me a nod, and smiled. You must be Walt's grandson, Cole Garrison. Hank Tiller. Been living here since '91. Your granddad and I used to sit on this very dock drinking beer until the bass quit biting. He reeled in his line, baited the hook again, and cast it back into the water. There's something you ought to know about these docks. I'm listening. Walt built every single one of them. All 14. When the subdivision went up, he let the HOA use them as a favor. Started with nothing more than a handshake. Then later somebody drew up some paperwork. But that woman turned the whole thing into a business. Hank leaned closer. She charges every household for a dock slip. $2,400 a year. 42 families pay it. That's over $100,000 every year, Cole. And nobody around here has ever seen where a penny of that money actually goes. I looked down the shoreline. 14 docks. 42 families. More than $100,000 a year. For 9 straight years. That night, after Owen fell asleep on the couch holding an old photograph of Grandpa Walt against his chest, I finally opened the cardboard box I had been putting off. The one marked Walt Legal. Inside were stacks of yellow documents, thick manila envelopes, faded survey maps, and a worn leather folder with my grandfather's initials stamped across the front in faded gold. I pulled the first document from the folder. It was the original property deed dated 1971. I stared at the words, but I wasn't ready to understand what they truly meant. Not yet. Still, I could feel myself getting closer to the truth. The county letter arrived the following Tuesday. It carried the official letterhead of Transylvania County Planning and Development. The notice informed me that an investigation had been opened regarding unauthorized structural modifications along the shoreline of Garrison Lake, and that all construction work had to stop immediately until the review was complete. It was signed by Patricia Hines, the department director. But thanks to the case number Hank helped me track down, I discovered the complaint had been filed by Dale Ashworth. Dale Ashworth, the county planning commissioner and Brenda Ashworth's husband. The same man responsible for approving construction permits across the county was now using his public office to investigate his wife's new neighbor over a few replacement dock boards. I didn't need legal training to recognize a conflict of interest. Common sense was enough. The next morning, I drove to the county offices in Brevard and spent 4 hours inside the records department. The clerk, a patient woman named Doris who smelled faintly of coffee and old microfilm, helped me locate the original subdivision plat filed back in 1983. I carefully traced the property boundaries with my finger. The developer had divided the land into 42 residential lots surrounding the lake, selling each one as premium lakefront property. The advertisements had promised waterfront living, but the recorded plat told a completely different story. The lakebed, the shoreline buffer, and every piece of dock infrastructure had been excluded from the subdivision. They remained under the ownership of the Garrison family. Every homeowner who had bought into the neighborhood since 1983 had purchased property beside a lake they never actually owned. Apparently, no one had ever bothered to read the fine print. Later that week, Brenda hosted what she proudly called the Garrison Lake Ladies' Wine Night. Every woman in the neighborhood received a beautifully hand-lettered invitation printed on blush pink cardstock. The gathering took place at the Ashworth residence, a 6,000-square-foot colonial mansion with towering white columns and a circular driveway that looked like it belonged in an old Southern movie. Brenda greeted her guests wearing a sleek black cocktail dress, pouring Pinot Grigio into crystal wine glasses while walking across polished hardwood floors, as though she were hosting a charity gala instead of an evening dedicated to neighborhood gossip. I only knew what happened because Nora Wells told me. Nora was 34, worked from home as a graphic designer, and was one of the few people in the neighborhood who hadn't completely bought into Brenda's version of reality. 2 nights after the gathering, she knocked quietly on my front door after dark, glancing over her shoulder as if she were carrying confidential information. "She's turning everyone against you," Nora said softly. "She told the whole neighborhood that you're planning to privatize the lake. She says you want to force families off the docks and start charging commercial rates." Nora hesitated before continuing. "She also told everyone she's worried about Owen growing up next to someone who doesn't respect community standards." I felt my jaw tighten. The moment she dragged my son into it, she crossed a line. "There's more," Nora added. "She's been collecting dock fees from all of us for 9 years. She says it pays for maintenance. $2,400 every year for each slip. But just look at those docks, Cole. Nothing has been maintained. They're falling apart. The money is going somewhere, but it definitely isn't going into those docks. How many families pay? I asked. 42, she replied. Everyone with a dock slip. I did the numbers in my head. $2,400 multiplied by 42 families came to $100,800 every single year. Over 9 years, that added up to more than $900,000 collected on property Brenda didn't even own, and supposedly spent on maintenance that clearly never happened. Does anyone have receipts? I asked. Nora reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded printout. Annual HOA Financial Summary. She pointed to one line. Dock maintenance, $8,000 every year. The exact same amount. It's like she isn't even trying to make it believable. After Nora left, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the report. $8,000 out of more than $100,000 collected each year. The remaining $92,800 simply disappeared. Year after year. 9 straight years of disappearing money. More than $800,000 gone like morning mist drifting across the lake. Except fog doesn't pay for Hermes handbags. Owen was asleep upstairs, and the house was completely still. I pulled Grandpa Walt's leather folder back onto the table and opened it again. This time I kept reading beyond the deed. Behind it was another document, a single typed page, notarized, dated 1985. The title read, Revocable License for Dock Use, Garrison Lake. I read every sentence carefully. Then I read it again. That was the moment I understood exactly what my grandfather had done. The dock license was brilliant because it was written in plain, unmistakable English. Grandpa had never hired an expensive attorney, yet he created a one-page document that left no room for confusion. It granted the Garrison Lake Estates Homeowners Association permission to use all 14 docks for recreation and personal boat mooring. The license was completely free. In return, the HOA was responsible for keeping every dock in good repair. Then came the final paragraph, typed in the same steady typewriter font as the rest of the page. This license is personal to Walter L. Garrison and shall terminate upon his death, incapacity, or written revocation. Grandpa had died 4 months earlier. The license had died with him. Every dock slip, every mooring cleat, every foot of shoreline the HOA had been treating like its own personal business for the past 9 years now sat on property that belonged to me under a license that no longer existed. Every dollar they had collected after that had no legal authorization. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt the quiet certainty of someone who knows the hardest part is still ahead. The truth was on my side, but getting justice was going to be messy. I didn't have to wait long for things to get ugly. On Friday morning, I was walking Owen down to dock number 1 for his usual after-school fishing spot when I spotted Jimmy Pratt. Jimmy was Brenda's handyman, the kind of man who had spent so many years carrying out other people's orders that he barely made any decisions of his own anymore. He was kneeling beside one of my grandfather's old cedar posts, driving screws into it with a cordless drill. Bolted to the post was a white metal sign with bright red letters. No trespassing. HOA property. My dock. My land. My grandfather's cedar. I stopped walking. Owen squeezed my hand a little tighter. About 10 feet behind Jimmy stood Brenda, supervising the whole project. She wore white linen pants, a cream silk blouse, and carried her Birkin bag beneath one arm like an executive carrying a clipboard. Her bright red nails flashed in the sunlight as she pointed toward the next dock. That one too, Jimmy. Every dock gets a sign. She noticed me watching and smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind that says, I wanted you to see this. I tried being nice, Cole, she said gently. The breeze carried another faint trace of Chanel No. 5 between us. This is what happens when people refuse to cooperate. I looked at the sign, then at the fresh drill holes in my grandfather's cedar, then at Jimmy, who suddenly found the ground very interesting. Finally, I looked back at Brenda, who never looked away. Those are impressive signs, Brenda, I said calmly. Very professional. Then I turned around, took Owen's hand, and walked back toward the house. Behind us, the drill started again. Owen stayed quiet until we reached the porch. Dad, why didn't you stop them? I knelt so we were looking at each other. Because sometimes, son, The smartest thing you can do is let people finish building the case against themselves. He didn't really understand. He would someday. That evening, after Owen had gone to bed, I stood at the kitchen window looking across the lake. Moonlight turned the water into silver glass. 14 docks stretched along the shoreline like piano keys. Every one of them held somebody's boat, somebody's favorite weekend, somebody's version of the perfect life. Every single dock belonged to me, and every single one had been making money for a woman who had absolutely no legal right to collect it. I opened my laptop and searched North Carolina Revocable Dock License Property Law. 3 hours later, I had court decisions, statutes, and legal precedent confirming exactly what I already suspected. The license had expired. The docks belonged to me, and the money Brenda had collected was never hers to keep. The following evening, Hank Tiller stopped by carrying a six-pack and an old memory. We sat together on the porch in the cool mountain air while frogs echoed across the lake. "Hank," he said after a long silence, "Walt told me something about 2 years before he passed. We were sitting right here watching the sunset. He looked at me and said, 'The day I'm gone, that dock license dies with me. And if the person who inherits this place has any sense at all, they'll make that woman answer for every dollar she took from my docks.'" Hank took a slow drink before looking over at me. "I think he was talking about you, Cole." I looked across the moonlit water where my grandfather had spent most of his life. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think he was." The next morning, I spread every document from Grandpa Walt's leather folder across the kitchen table. The original deed, the subdivision plat, the revocable dock license, and tax records dating all the way back to 1971. I arranged everything in chronological order, held the pages flat with coffee mugs, and let the documents tell their own story. In 1971, Walter Garrison recorded the original deed with Transylvania County. It described 200 acres of mountain property, a dammed creek, and a 40-acre private lake. The language left no room for interpretation. The grantor retains ownership of the lakebed, all riparian and littoral rights, the shoreline extending 50 feet above mean water level, and all dock infrastructure constructed or to be constructed thereon. In 1983, he sold 140 acres to Blue Ridge Premier Development for the construction of Garrison Lake Estates. The recorded subdivision map divided the land into 42 residential lots surrounding the lake. But the lake itself, the shoreline buffer, and every dock were highlighted separately and clearly marked. Retained Garrison family. Every title search since 1983 should have caught it. Apparently, none of them ever did. Then, in 1985, after the first homeowners began asking about access to the lake, my grandfather drafted the revocable dock license. He gave the HOA permission to use all 14 docks without charging a single dollar. The only requirement was that they keep the docks properly maintained, and the final clause left no room for debate. The license would automatically end upon his death. That's where the story stopped being about arrogance and started looking like something much more serious. I laid the HOA financial reports Nora had given me beside my grandfather's dock license. For the first 6 years after the subdivision was built, everything followed the agreement. Dock access was free under Grandpa's license, and maintenance was handled by volunteers from the neighborhood. Then Brenda Ashworth became HOA president. During her very first year in office, a new line appeared in the annual budget. Dock access and mooring fees, $2,400 per slip each year. 42 slips. $100,800 in annual income. The revenue was enormous. The expenses were almost laughable. Every yearly report listed dock maintenance and repairs at exactly $8,000. The number never changed. 9 straight years. No contractor names. No invoices. No receipts. Just the same perfectly round figure repeated over and over. $8,000 on paper against more than $100,000 coming in. I grabbed a calculator. 9 years of dock fees totaled $907,200. 9 years of reported maintenance came to only $72,000. That left $835,200 completely unaccounted for. More than $835,000 collected on my family's property under a license that was supposed to be completely free, by a woman who had never owned a single board of those docks. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the numbers. Morning sunlight poured through the kitchen window and landed on my grandfather's handwriting across the dock license. The letters were neat, steady, and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had built everything he owned with his own hands and believed a simple piece of paper would protect it after he was gone. "She's been collecting rent on our land for 9 years, Grandpa," I said quietly to the empty kitchen. Owen was at school. The house was silent. Through the open window, I could hear gentle waves tapping against the dock pilings. The same sound my grandfather must have listened to every morning for decades. I didn't call the sheriff. Not yet. There would be a time for that. When it happened, it would happen loudly. Instead, I picked up the phone and called Claire Newsom, the most respected real estate attorney in Brevard. "Claire, I need you to look at something," I said. "I believe the HOA president has been operating a commercial dock rental business on my property for the last 9 years without my family's permission. And I think she's been pocketing roughly $93,000 a year." The line went completely silent for several seconds. Then Claire spoke. "Bring every document you have. Today." Claire Newsom's office sat above a hardware store on Main Street in Brevard, where the air always smelled faintly of fresh-cut lumber and machine oil. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, wearing reading glasses on a chain, with the confident handshake of someone who had won far more courtroom battles than she had lost. She cleared the conference table, and I spread every document across it as carefully as if I were preparing a military briefing. She read the deed first, then the subdivision plat, then the dock license. Finally, she studied the HOA financial reports. For 12 full minutes, she didn't say a single word. When she finished, she removed her glasses, placed them gently on the table, and looked at me with an expression that made my pulse quicken. "Cole," she said quietly, "you don't just own the docks. You own the lakebed, the shoreline, and everything from the water's edge to 50 feet above the bank," Claire said. "For the past 9 years, the HOA has been operating a commercial dock rental business on your property without authorization, without compensation, and without your family's permission." She tapped the dock license with her finger. "And this document changes everything. It was personal to your grandfather. The moment he passed away, the license expired. Every dock slip in that subdivision has been occupied without legal authority for the last 4 months. What are my options?" I asked. "There are several." She pulled a legal pad closer. "First, I'll file a quiet title action in Transylvania County Superior Court. That asks the court to officially confirm your ownership of the lakebed, shoreline, and dock infrastructure. Based on these documents, I don't see much room for argument." She made another note before continuing. "Second, I'll subpoena the HOA's complete financial records, bank statements, vendor invoices, contracts, everything. If the dock fees went where I believe they did, we could be looking at criminal conversion of funds, possibly embezzlement." She paused for a moment. "As for the docks themselves, you have every legal right to revoke access immediately. Every boat tied to those docks is sitting on your property without your permission." I thought about what she had said. Then I thought about the 42 families who had spent years paying Brenda for something she never owned. They were victims too. They just didn't know it yet. "Let her keep collecting," I finally said. "Every dollar she takes from this point forward is one more dollar that can be added to the case." Claire smiled the way experienced lawyers do when they already know who's going to win, but the other side hasn't figured it out yet. The following week moved quickly. On Wednesday, Pete Langford, a licensed surveyor from Hendersonville, arrived with GPS equipment and a 2-man crew. For 3 days, they mapped every foot of the shoreline. I walked beside them, pointing out each dock and sharing everything I knew from Grandpa Walt's notes along with my own experience. 18 years building piers, harbors, and waterfront facilities for the Navy had taught me more about shoreline construction than most engineers learn in an entire career. Pete's final survey left no room for doubt. All 14 docks were located entirely within the Garrison family property. The 50-foot shoreline buffer also belonged to the Garrison estate. Even the walking path the HOA had paved along the lake 3 years earlier sat on Garrison land. Every dock, every improvement, Every sign Brenda had installed. Every single one stood on property she had absolutely no authority to control. While Pete's crew completed the survey, I quietly installed 6 trail cameras along the shoreline, waterproof housings, motion sensors, infrared night vision. I hid them inside hollow dock posts, beneath loose tree bark, and under the eaves of the old boathouse. Years of CB fieldwork had taught me how to install equipment that nobody would ever notice unless they already knew exactly where to look. Each camera uploaded directly to a secure cloud server that I could monitor from my laptop. Claire's subpoena reached the HOA's registered agent that Friday. By Monday morning, the financial records were sitting on her desk. What they revealed was even worse than I expected. Brenda had formed a limited liability company called Garrison Lake Services. She had named the company after my family's lake and funneled every dock fee through that business instead of the HOA. The bank records showed deposits matching the annual dock payments, followed by transfers directly into Brenda's personal accounts. The money paid for luxury spa visits in Asheville, payments at a Mercedes dealership in Charlotte, vacation rentals in Hilton Head. Meanwhile, Hank Tiller had been working quietly around the neighborhood. As a retired history teacher, he had a gift for earning people's trust with patience, honesty, and facts instead of pressure. One by one, he spoke with the residents and gathered signed statements. By the end of the week, 15 homeowners had signed affidavits confirming they had paid dock fees for years and had never once received a complete financial accounting explaining where their money had actually gone. 3 of those homeowners had even asked Brenda for the financial records themselves. Every time she gave the same answer. Those documents are confidential under HOA board policy. Nora Wells brought me the final piece of the puzzle. She showed up at my door one Thursday evening carrying a flash drive. Brenda's planning something, she said. At the annual meeting, she wants the members to vote on officially annexing the lake. She's going to claim the lake and every dock as permanent HOA common property. She thinks if she gets it approved on paper before you act, you won't be able to stop her. I plugged the drive into my laptop. Inside were a draft resolution, the meeting agenda, and a PowerPoint presentation titled Securing Our Community's Future. I printed the agenda and circled the meeting date. 3 weeks away. She's really planning to stand in front of 80 people and claim ownership of property that belongs to me, I said. Nora nodded. What are you going to do? I opened the filing cabinet where I kept Claire's case binder. Inside were copies of the deed, the subdivision plat, the dock license, the survey, the financial records, the bank statements, the trail camera footage, and a complete evidence log. 3 identical sets. 1 for the court. 1 for the sheriff. 1 for the meeting. I'm going to let her. News travels fast around a lakeside neighborhood. Within 2 days of Pete Langford placing survey stakes along the shoreline, Brenda Ashworth found out. And Brenda Ashworth had never been good at losing control. She pulled up to the survey site on a Wednesday afternoon in her white Escalade, parking sideways across the gravel access road as though she were blocking off an accident scene. She climbed out wearing a crisp white blazer over black skinny jeans and stiletto ankle boots, an outfit that looked more appropriate for a fashion magazine than a muddy shoreline in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Her Birkin bag rested on her arm. Her Chanel sunglasses sat on top of her head like a crown. She walked toward Pete with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime believing she was always right. Each step drove her heels deeper into the soft clay. By the time she reached him, she was practically balancing with every stride. "Excuse me," she said with a polished smile. "This is HOA property. You don't have permission to survey here." Pete Langford had been surveying land for more than 40 years. Long before Brenda Ashworth ever cared about property lines. He never even looked up from his GPS receiver. Instead, he reached into his vest, removed a folded document, and held it out. "Court order, ma'am." Brenda unfolded the paper and read it. Her smile didn't disappear. It simply froze. The kind of frozen smile that happens when the face keeps pretending everything is fine while the brain suddenly realizes it isn't. "We'll see about that," she said. She spun around and headed back toward her Escalade. On her 3rd step, one stiletto heel sank deep into the wet clay. She pulled. The shoe stayed put. She tugged harder. Her foot slipped out, leaving one stocking-covered foot planted directly in the mud. For 2 long seconds, she stood there wearing one shoe while the other remained buried in the bank. Then she bent down, yanked it free, shoved her foot back inside, and hurried toward the SUV. Red clay covered the designer heel almost to the ankle. She glanced around to see if anyone had witnessed it. Pete never looked away from his equipment. I watched quietly from the tree line. She couldn't tell. Everyone had seen. 2 days later, Dale Ashworth made his move. The County Planning Board issued a stop work order covering every construction or modification project within 500 feet of the Garrison Lake shoreline. The language sounded broad and official. In reality, it affected only one property. Mine. Claire Newsom filed a formal objection within 24 hours, citing Dale's obvious conflict of interest. Soon afterward, the County Ethics Board opened a preliminary investigation. Dale's name now appeared in 2 different files. One at the courthouse, one at the ethics office. Brenda, however, wasn't interested in waiting for government paperwork. On Saturday morning, I reviewed the trail camera recordings. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, Jimmy Pratt appeared wearing dark clothes and a headlamp. He walked onto dock number 1 and bolted another no trespassing sign onto the same cedar post where Owen always hung his fishing rod. The new sign was twice the size of the old one. It completely covered the spot where Owen had carved his initials with the pocket knife I had given him for his birthday. After breakfast, Owen walked down to the dock. He stopped, looked at the sign, said nothing. Then he quietly turned around, walked back to the porch, and sat on the steps staring across the lake. I sat beside him. Neither of us spoke. We simply watched the water that belonged to us while a sign that didn't belong there stood guard over it. 3 more weeks, buddy, I finally said. Just 3 more weeks. That evening, Brenda sent an email to every homeowner in the subdivision. The subject line read, "Protecting what's ours." The message announced that the HOA had hired legal counsel to permanently secure our community lake and dock assets, and that the upcoming annual meeting would finalize a historic vote protecting Garrison Lake for future generations. She signed it proudly, Brenda L. Ashworth, President, Garrison Lake Estates HOA, established 2015, as though nothing had existed before she arrived, as though the HOA began with her, as though the lake hadn't been there for decades, as though my grandfather had never built those docks with his own hands. I saved the email and added it to Claire's evidence binder. Another exhibit, another piece of proof, another brick in the wall. Later that night, Nora sent me a text. She just posted a selfie standing on one of the docks. It read, caption, "Protecting what's ours." Red nail emoji. I never replied. I didn't need to. The cameras were recording. The survey had been filed. The subpoena had been answered. The quiet title lawsuit was already on the court calendar. And Brenda Ashworth was still building the strongest case anyone could have asked for. She just didn't realize she was building it for me. The following Tuesday night, Brenda called an emergency HOA meeting. Not the annual meeting that was still 2 weeks away. It was a special meeting called under Article 9 of the HOA bylaws, a provision allowing the board to hold an emergency vote with only 48 hours notice on matters of urgent community concern. According to Brenda's notice, that urgent concern was the unauthorized claim of ownership over community lake and dock assets by a non-compliant resident. The non-compliant resident was me, the grandson of the man whose name was on the lake, the docks, the subdivision, and the stone entrance sign every homeowner drove past twice a day. I attended the meeting. I sat quietly in the last row. I didn't bring Claire. I didn't bring the evidence binder. I simply watched. Brenda stood at the front of the community room wearing a pearl white pantsuit and nude patent heels. Her hair had been professionally styled. Her makeup was flawless, and she looked less like someone running a homeowners meeting than someone preparing to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award. Tom Briggs sat beside her with a stack of printed ballots. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brenda announced, "our community is facing a serious threat. A new resident has made completely unfounded claims regarding ownership of our lake and dock facilities. Tonight, we will approve a resolution officially declaring these assets permanent HOA common property. ensuring they remain protected for every family in this neighborhood. She read the resolution aloud. 3 paragraphs of polished legal language that sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing. It declared the lake, the shoreline, and all 14 docks to be permanent common property of the Garrison Lake Estates Homeowners Association, held forever for the benefit of its members. Held forever. On land she didn't own. Under a license that had already expired. While the money generated from that property had been flowing into her personal accounts for years. Tom Briggs called for the vote. 28 hands went up in favor. 14 voted no. Most of the opposition came from Hank Tiller's group, the neighbors who knew something wasn't right, even if they still didn't understand just how deep the problem went. Brenda ignored the opposing votes. She focused only on the majority. The resolution passes. She smiled with complete confidence. The lake and all dock infrastructure are now officially HOA common property. I stood up. The room fell silent. Every face turned toward me. Brenda kept smiling, but the tension around her eyes gave her away. For the record, I said calmly, an HOA cannot acquire privately owned property through an internal membership vote. That isn't how property law works in North Carolina or anywhere else. I buttoned my jacket. I'll see you at the annual meeting, Brenda. Then I walked out. Behind me, the room erupted into whispers as more than 80 people tried to process what they had just witnessed. A president confidently claiming ownership of property she didn't own, and a complete stranger calmly telling her she was wrong. 3 days later, Brenda called Sheriff Wade Colton. She reported me for trespassing on HOA property and for unauthorized construction along the shoreline. She demanded that I be removed from the docks. Sheriff Colton drove to the lake house on Thursday afternoon. I invited him inside, poured him a cup of coffee, and placed 3 documents on the kitchen table. The deed, the dock license, Pete Langford's survey. He read each one carefully, took another sip of coffee, then looked up at me. Mr. Garrison, he said, I'm not removing a man from his own property. I appreciate that, Sheriff. He stood, adjusted his hat, and paused at the front door. You should probably bring every one of these documents to the annual meeting. I already planned to. After the sheriff left, whatever patience Brenda still had finally disappeared. This time she arrived in Dale's black BMW instead of her white Escalade. She parked in the gravel driveway without asking permission. She never came to the front door. Instead, she marched straight onto dock number 1 and stood at the end facing the house, raising her voice loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. You think you can come here and steal what this community built? She shouted. I've run this neighborhood for 9 years. Nobody challenges me and stays. The breeze caught her white blouse as she pointed directly at me. The families before you disappeared, Cole. You should think about that. I stood quietly on the porch. I didn't answer. The trail camera mounted on dock number 1 had a perfect view of her face, her gestures, and the license plate on Dale's BMW. Let her talk. Let her threaten. Every sentence became another piece of evidence. That night, I reviewed the camera footage again. At exactly 2:14 a.m., Jimmy Pratt returned. This time, he untied my boat from dock number 1 and sliced the mooring rope with a knife. The boat drifted slowly into the middle of the lake. I watched the recording 3 times, saved copies onto 2 separate drives, then emailed the footage directly to Claire. At sunrise, Owen and I rowed out to retrieve the boat. He held the oar steady while I pulled us alongside. Morning fog floated across the lake like a blanket. Neither of us spoke. We simply worked together. That afternoon, Claire called with another discovery. Cole, she said, I pulled the incorporation records for Garrison Lake Services. And Brenda created the LLC in 2016, 1 year after becoming HOA president. She named the company after your family's lake. I waited. There's more, Claire continued. The registered agent for the company is Dale Ashworth. The planning commissioner investigating me through his county office was also the registered agent for the company collecting money from my property. You couldn't invent a conflict like that, unless your name happened to be Brenda Ashworth. The annual meeting of the Garrison Lake Estates Homeowners Association took place on the first Saturday of November inside the cedar-sided Community Hall, a building that smelled of lemon furniture polish and decades of committee meetings. 83 residents filled the rows of folding chairs. Behind the podium stood Brenda Ashworth, dressed as though she were about to be crowned. A white cocktail dress, a strand of pearls, designer heels with bright red soles flashing every time she shifted her weight, perfect platinum curls. Her Birkin bag rested beside the microphone like a trophy she had presented to herself. The PowerPoint behind her displayed the title, Securing Our Community's Future. She clicked through slides showing budgets, accomplishments, and glowing praise for her own leadership. Not once did she explain where the dock money had actually gone. Tonight, she announced confidently, leaning toward the microphone, we will vote to permanently annex the lake and all dock infrastructure as HOA common property. This protects every family in this community. Tom Briggs applauded. From the front row, Dale Ashworth joined in. Polite applause filled the room, the kind people give out of habit rather than belief. Brenda opened the floor for comments. 3 homeowners asked easy questions. She answered each one effortlessly, like someone who had rehearsed every word in front of a mirror. Then I stood up. Last row. Flannel shirt. Work boots. 1 manila envelope. The room fell silent. The kind of silence that settles in just before something happens that can never be undone. Madam President, I said, before this vote, I'd like to present a few documents. Her smile never moved. The chair recognizes Mr. Garrison. I walked to the front of the room and opened the envelope. This is the original deed filed by Walter L. Garrison in 1971. I read the most important sentence aloud. The grantor retains ownership of the lakebed, all riparian and littoral rights, the shoreline extending 50 feet above mean water level, and all dock infrastructure. I looked around the room. My grandfather built this lake. He built every one of these docks. He sold the land surrounding it, but he never sold the water. Whispers spread through the audience. I continued. This is the revocable dock license signed in 1985. I held up the page. The final clause states, this license terminates upon the death of Walter L. Garrison. My grandfather died 4 months ago. That license is gone. The whispers became loud conversations. I placed another stack of papers on the podium. These are the HOA financial records. Dock fees collected each year, $100,800. 42 paying families. More than $900,000 collected. The reports show only $8,000 per year spent on maintenance. So where did the rest of the money go? I laid down the bank statements. It went into a company called Garrison Lake Services. An LLC registered to Brenda Ashworth. Registered agent, Dale Ashworth. From there, the money moved into personal accounts. A luxury spa in Asheville. A Mercedes dealership in Charlotte. A vacation rental in Hilton Head. Brenda lunged toward the papers. Her hand swept across the podium. One of her bright red gel nails snapped off and struck the wood with a sharp click. Documents scattered across the floor. As she reached forward, her pearl necklace caught on the microphone stand. The clasp broke. Pearls rolled across the hardwood floor, bouncing beneath chairs like tiny white marbles, each one sounding like another count in the indictment against her. The rear door opened. Sheriff Wade Colton entered with a deputy. He walked directly to the podium and held out a sealed envelope. Mrs. Ashworth, he said calmly, you've been served. Transylvania County has filed charges including embezzlement, fraud, and criminal conversion of funds exceeding $800,000. Brenda's hands trembled as she accepted the papers. A thin line of mascara slipped down one cheek, leaving a dark streak across makeup that had looked flawless less than an hour earlier. Her Birkin bag slid from the podium and landed on the floor with a soft thud. She turned to leave. One designer heel caught in a gap between the old floorboards. She pulled. The shoe stayed behind. Her foot slipped out. For a long moment she stood there wearing one shoe while her other stocking-covered foot rested on the hardwood in front of 83 homeowners who had just learned they had spent years paying a thief. Dale rose from the front row. Sheriff Colton raised a hand. "Mr. Ashworth, the County Ethics Board will also be speaking with you. Please remain available." Dale slowly sat back down. I gathered the scattered papers, stacked them neatly, and faced the audience. "I'm not here to take your docs away. I'm here to take them back from someone who was stealing from every one of us." Hank Tiller was the first to clap. Slow, steady. The applause of a man who had waited years to see the truth come out. Nora Wells stood next. Then another homeowner. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall echoed with applause. Brenda Ashworth limped out the side door wearing one shoe, carrying a subpoena in one hand while leaving her Birkin bag behind. No one bothered to pick it up. 6 weeks later, the indictment became official. Brenda Ashworth was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and criminal conversion after investigators traced more than $835,000 through a shell company named after the very family she had been stealing from. Dale Ashworth was removed from the Transylvania County Planning Commission while an ethics investigation examined his use of public office against a private citizen. The white Escalade was seized through asset forfeiture. The last time I saw it, it sat in the county impound lot with a bright yellow wool boot attached and dried mud still covering the running board. Brenda appeared at her arraignment wearing a plain gray cotton dress and inexpensive flat shoes. No designer heels. No Birkin bag. No pearl necklace. Those pearls were probably still hiding beneath the chairs in the community hall. There was no Chanel No. 5. The polished red nails had been replaced by short, bare fingertips bitten nearly to the skin. She looked like someone whose entire identity had been switched off. She entered a plea of not guilty in such a quiet voice that the court reporter asked her to repeat herself. The quiet title hearing lasted less than 5 minutes. The judge reviewed the 1971 deed, the subdivision plat, the revocable dock license, and Pete Langford's survey before ruling that Cole Garrison was the sole legal owner of Garrison Lake, the shoreline extending 50 feet above the normal water level, and all 14 dock structures. With remarkable understatement, the judge observed that the Homeowners Association appeared to have operated a commercial enterprise on the plaintiff's property without authorization for approximately 9 years. That afternoon, I walked the shoreline, all 14 docks. I ran my hand across every cedar post, every railing, every galvanized cleat. Each one reminded me of my grandfather, a man who believed that the things built with honest hands would always outlast the people who built them. A week later, I drafted a new dock access agreement. $600 per slip each year instead of $2,400. Every dollar placed into a transparent maintenance fund. Independent audits every year. Complete financial reports mailed to every homeowner. No more fake $8,000 maintenance budgets. No more luxury handbags bought with neighbors' trust. 41 of the 42 dock holders signed the new agreement during the very first week. Tom Briggs signed the new agreement on the 12th day after Hank Tiller spent an hour on his front porch explaining, with the calm patience of a retired history teacher, the difference between loyalty and enabling someone who was wrong. The final settlement recovered $320,000 from Brenda's seized assets. I used every cent to establish the Walter Garrison Youth Sailing Scholarship, paying for sailing lessons, boating safety certification, and summer camp opportunities for children across Transylvania County who otherwise would never have the chance to experience life on the water. Owen became the very first student enrolled. He learned to rig a sunfish sailboat on dock number 1, the same dock where his great-grandfather had driven the very first cedar piling more than 50 years earlier. The neighborhood elected an entirely new HOA board. Hank Tiller agreed to serve as interim president. Nora Wells accepted the role of treasurer. Their first official decision was publishing every financial record from the previous decade, including all the reports Brenda had insisted were confidential under board policy. Their second decision was removing every no trespassing sign from every dock around the lake. One quiet Saturday afternoon in early December, Owen and I sat together on dock number 1. He held a fishing rod. I held a thermos of coffee. The air carried the smell of pine sap mixed with smoke drifting down from somewhere higher in the mountains. The lake was perfectly calm. The surrounding hills reflected across the water like a painting no one could ever own. Owen reeled in his line, baited the hook again, and cast it back across the lake. After a long moment, he looked at me. Dad, I think Grandpa Walt would really like it here. I watched the fishing line settle across the water. I watched the ripples spread toward the docks my grandfather had built, across the lake he had created, on the land he had protected. He always did, buddy, I said softly. He always did. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe. It's completely free, and it helps support the channel more than you might realize. It also makes sure you never miss the next story. Every week I share stories about homeowners standing up to abusive HOAs, neighborhood bullies, power-hungry officials, and people who believe a title or clipboard gives them authority over everyone else. These aren't fairy tales with magical endings. They're stories about ordinary people who fight back using documents, evidence, good lawyers, public records, and the patience that comes from understanding their rights. Cole didn't lose his temper. He didn't make threats. He read every document, hired the right attorney, gathered evidence, installed cameras, and waited for Brenda to make the mistake she always made. She pushed too far. And when she did, he was ready. If you've ever dealt with an HOA president who treated the neighborhood like a personal kingdom, share your experience in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you know someone who's fighting an HOA dispute right now, send them this video. Sometimes, simply knowing someone else has been through the same battle is the first step toward standing your ground. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.